Good morning and welcome to Pine Needles Quilt and Sew in Rochester, Minnesota. I am Joy Inglet and thank you for stopping by my virtual booth today. We are participating in the Minnesota Virtual Quilt Show and thank you BERNINA for sponsoring our booth. Today's focus is going to be on some frequently asked questions that we get at the quilt shop, and specifically me, who teaches the master classes. And the topic is seams perfect. There are many factors that go into making that perfect seam on a pieced work, and there's always that scuttlebutt about the scant quarter inch or the perfect quarter inch or whatever, but there are many factors that can affect the end result of your sewing. Now, from a mechanical point of view, and BERNINA specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the equipment that comes with the machine. I'm going to talk about needle choice and thread. So let's start with needle choice. Believe it or not, needles are really important to the quality of your stitch and how things come out. Not all needles are created equal, and I'm not talking about brands. We do carry BERNINA needles in our store, and we also carry Schmetz brand needles. Both are high quality needles, and your BERNINA machine will love to have them in there. But what I'm talking about is the actual construction of a needle. And when we talk about a needle, there are different tips that are on our needles, and that can affect how it pierces through the fabric that we are stitching. And it can also affect how your thread lies on your fabric. A part of that discussion also is the shaft that is on the needle. Depending on what size needle you have chose to put with your thread, you can have either too big or too little, kind of like Mama Bear, Baby Bear, and Papa Bear. The one you're looking for is the one that is just right. Now, in most cases when we're piecing, an 80-12 needle would be an appropriate size needle because the shaft on the back of the needle is sized to the lighter weight threads that we use, like Aurifil, which is a 50 weight, or maybe you use the Confetti brand thread that we carry in our store. Those things usually work very well in an 80-12 needle. Now, that can change. Our machines are high tech. They have all these bells and whistles and features and functions on them. But in the end, really, it is up to you to make the best choice for what you are stitching and sewing. Depending on what you're sewing, your needle need may change. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to highlight this in a minute, is the tip of the needle. Some needles have really sharp points, some are rounded, some are a little bit of a combination of others. And when we're talking specifically about piecing, we have a variety of needles that we offer in our shop, and one size doesn't fit all. Really, the needle can be the single biggest, most important change in your needle work. Now, when we talk about needles, some commonly used needles, first of all, many of you use a universal 80-12. There is nothing wrong with that, but understand that a universal needle has a more rounded edge, and when you piece with that particular needle, you will find, if you look at your straight seam, that your stitch may wander a little one way or the other, because the universal needle with that rounded tip is going to wiggle its way to one side of the warp thread or the other, and it's going to create a stitch that's maybe not perfectly tracking straight. There's nothing wrong with that, but if that is something that concerns you, then maybe think about a different needle. Another needle that many piecers use, and actually one of my personal favorites, is the Microtex needle. Now, the Microtex needle has a really sharp point on it. It is the favorite one for paper piecers because it makes nice clean holes through the paper, and it cleanly pierces through the very densely woven batiks that are typically used in paper piecing. Again, in a Microtex needle, I would use an 80-12 for my standard Aurifil weight thread. But if you're going to use a smaller thread like the Deco Bob thread, then you may go down to a smaller needle, as do many of the paper piecers in the world. That way they get the best results for the technique that they are doing. they typically will reduce their stitch length as well when they work on that. So Microtex needles. Another needle that I use often is the quilting needle. Now this happens to come in a size 90-14. It still works actually very well for the Aurifil thread, because on this particular needle it's a little bit of a cross breed. The tip of the needle is slightly rounded so that it can pierce through the fabric without damaging your fibers. But more importantly, the shaft of the needle, this part of the needle, is tapered so it can kind of gently enter all those thick layers. Think about you're making that Lemoyne star and you have all those layers of fabric in between. When you put a quilting needle in your machine, you really have a nice setup because the needle is geared to the job you wish to do on a cotton fabric. It is a good idea to have these needles in your toolbox, and we do offer several of them online. We also have a full complement of needles in our store. But again, needles are important to the success of our project, and they should be changed every 4 to 6 hours, or if you actually hear a popping sound as it's entering. As your needle works, a little bit of that metal surface is worn away each time it pierces its fabric, and it will get dull, and dull needles break or bend, and then they cause damage to your machine in that action. So the most important thing you can do for your perfect seaming is to make sure you use a needle that is appropriate for what you are doing, and you change that needle often. So a little bit about needles. Could I have a look at the front of my machine? So on a BERNINA machine, there is a cool feature, and it is found under the needle function. Now this is an 880 that I'm demoing. On some models you'll have the picture of the needle with a stitch plate, but when I select the needle and I open it up, there is this needle with a bow. And here is actually a guide to help you pick the appropriate needle and kind of remind you of the purposes of these needles. On the machine, you could select that you put a Microtex in, and you could select the weight. This does not change any properties in your machine. It's simply a reminder of what needle you have put in. Many needles today have that fun color coding on them, which is very nice, but if you're like me, I can never remember what they mean. So I like to use the needle minder found on my BERNINAs to help me remember what needle I have put in my machine. So that's just a little bit about needles. And lastly, many of you like to make graduation quilts. And in graduation quilts, we sometimes, well, not sometimes, we often or actually always put that stabilizer on the back, and that has a little bit of stick to it, and using a super non-stick needle in your machine will help you quilt through those t-shirts, but also help you piece through those t-shirts. And they're called super universals because typically those quilts are a t-shirt quilt, and a universal or a jersey needle are going to be your best choices for quilting or piecing through that kind of fabric. So needles make a big difference in your finished result. So that's a little bit about needles. So let's start with, of course, a fresh needle, a newly oiled and cleaned machine, and then let's move on to the next component of our machine. When we purchase our machines, we have a zigzag plate on this machine, and could I have a look at this one? So when we talk about the straight stitch plate, I'm sorry about the blinking, we didn't turn off the autofocus feature this morning. We have these nice etched lines to help us find our way. This is a 9mm stitch width, and it's quite wide. And when you think about doing a straight stitch and piercing your needle right through the middle, you have quite a lot of fabric that can push into the hole as you go along. To get better results for piecing, it is a good idea to replace the zigzag plate on your machine with a straight stitch plate. On a straight stitch plate, you have a single hole in the middle where your needle is piercing down through. Now, all BERNINA feet are designed, especially with that 1/4 inch seam foot in mind, it has a channel. So your fabric is supported on both sides of the needle, and it's supported for a long ways. By using this straight stitch plate, your needle goes straight down into this hole and your fabric is firmly supported so it can form a really nice stitch. Puckering and ruffling can happen in your sewing when your fabric is not properly supported by your stitch plate and your stitch foot. And oftentimes we take a look at this and we say, oh, my tension is off. Now, your tension could potentially be off, but most times BERNINA got it right. Their averages are there and they're wonderful, but that doesn't mean you can't change them. But oftentimes I find it's actually a different choice that needs to be made rather than my tension. Maybe it's my stitch plate. Maybe it's the weight of my foot, the presser foot weight on my fabric that's causing my fabric to wrinkle or pucker as I go along. Or oftentimes it's when I forget to engage my dual feed on a dual feed foot. A dual feed foot has to have that integrated dual feed dropped in. Now, if you're not a BERNINA owner and you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll illustrate that in a minute with the feet. But with a dual feed foot, actually I'm going to grab one out of my bag, you'll see it straddles like, you know, a cowboy on a horse. You have this big opening. In that big open area, that dual feed is meant to come down and provide support in the back and also help feed your fabric from the front to the back. If you don't have that foot down in place, there's nothing supporting your fabric. You have this big open channel, and again, your fabric can do what's called flagging. It can pucker up and it looks terrible. And sometimes, even me who has sewn for years and I teach my mastery classes, I get in a hurry, I put my foot on and I forget to put that dual feed down, and I'm a few inches into my piecing and I wonder, wow, did I forget to put my presser foot up when I threaded? What is going on? And then I realize, oh, you forgot to put your dual feed down. It is important. It isn't an option with these dual feed feet. It is a necessary thing. There are other feet that don't need that dual feed, and they are designed without that opening. It's just a part of the engineering of the machine, and when you work with your machine rather than against your machine, you're going to get best results. So I've just talked about support. Support is really important in all stitching, no matter what brand machine you have. You need to have your stitch form because your needle goes down, it grabs that bottom thread, and the stitch is formed in the middle. But in that process, your fabric can pull a little bit, and that stitch needs to be right in the middle. Therefore, you need to have good support on your fabric so it doesn't pull up or push down into your plate. So think about that when you're stitching. If your machine did not come with a straight stitch plate, a straight stitch plate is highly recommended. Second best option is to move your needle position to one of the far edges of your open area. That at least will better support your fabric on 3 sides of your stitch plate. But the real answer is to invest in a straight stitch plate to have better and more perfect seam possibilities. Set yourself up for success. Make sewing fun. Okay, so let's go on to this discussion. I talked about having these different feet. So let's have a look at these. BERNINA offers 3 basic numbered styles of feet. They have the original number 37 foot, and when this foot, let me find it here in front of me, I happen to have the 37D foot, which is designed to work with a dual feed system, but there's also just a plain 37 foot. When we look at this foot, let me put this out. When we look at this foot, it has very even sides on both sides, and it is sized to be exactly 1/4 inch. Your needle's here, 1/4 inch on both sides, so you can move your fabric either way. You'll notice again that channel that I talked about, your fabric is fully supported all around here. It opens up here so you have a little better visibility. You can also stitch a perfect 1/8 inch seam on this machine, but this has a very narrow footprint. So let me show you this on a stitch plate. So here is a 9mm stitch plate, and if I were to set this on top, you'll see, I hope maybe, that your foot isn't really covering your feed dogs on this stitch plate. When your foot is not covering your feed dogs, there is less of your feed dogs to help you feed your fabric through, and your fabric may wobble one side or the other. If your fabric is doing that, it is of course possible that it's maybe your presser foot weight, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But know that the 37 foot really is designed for machines that have a 5.5mm stitch width, meaning your feed dogs are closer together. And in this particular case, the standard 37 foot, which is your 1/4 inch foot, would go on the 475 Quilters Edition. It would go on the BERNINA 535, which has that 5.5mm. And then BERNINA did make some models of 7 series that had a 5.5mm stitch width that had a dual feed system, and that is where this particular foot idea concept came from, the 37D. If you have one of those smaller machines, maybe it's I didn't even mention the 325 or the 335, maybe you own a 215 or other models. The straight number 37 foot is the one you want for those 5.5mm machines. Now some of you like a guide on your foot. So BERNINA has another 1/4 inch seam foot. It is the number 57 foot. It comes both in the model that would have the crystal, indicating that it would be like on a 9mm style machine. But again, the footprint of this foot is for a 5.5mm feed dog system, and there is a plain version of this as well. Now, as piecers and quilters, many of you have gone big because you want all that extra creative space. And the foot for you, for your 9mm machines that are big, like our 7 series or the 8 series behind me, is the 97 foot. Now, the 97 foot comes in actually 3 different varieties. We have the 97 and the 97, actually 2 varieties, the 97 and the 97D. In my hand, I have the 97. On my machine behind me, I have the 97D, which allows me to use my dual feed on my machine to help feed my fabric through. So if we take a look at the two of these side by side, the one in this hand is so much wider than the one on the left. That is so it can sit on the wider feed dog systems and support your fabric better. This also has that tight little groove in between, and both of these have a really nice groove down the center to allow our seams to pass through without catching as we sew. This foot also still can do an 1/8 inch seam. It has markings inside, and you can shift your fabric on the foot to accomplish that. And just like the 37 cousin, we do have the markings on the foot a 1/4 inch behind, at the needle, and in the front. So you are setting yourself up for best success if you have those bigger machines to use the foot number 97. Now, if you've been watching along in our virtual booth, you'll know that the 97D foot is a gift with purchase with our larger machines that do not include that 1/4 inch seam foot with our machine. So that can make a big difference in your finished seam, is having, again, your foot supporting the fabric from the top. Now, in addition to this, let's talk a little bit about stitch length. And let me grab some samples that I've made. Remember, you are the scientist or the discoverer in your sewing studio, and it's nice to just sit down and sew, but sometimes it's a good idea to take a moment, take some of those leftover jelly strips or cut some 2.5 inch strips and play with your stitch length and your foot pressure and see what gives you the best results on your machine. So I have created a little bit of a sample here, and I'll bring it closer. But this morning I took 2 strips of fabric. I didn't press them because this is how they came out of my cabinet. I put them together the way I might put them together, because although I am quite faithful about pressing my fabric ahead of time, sometimes I just want to quick piece something together. So I didn't alter this with starch. I didn't change it. I didn't press the fabric ahead of time. And I'm pointing that out because, you know, it still works as a stitch idea sample. So at the beginning here, I started with a 3.0 stitch length. And when I look at this, and I'm not sure we can see this on camera, maybe not, maybe I have to turn it up. Here I have a 3.0, meaning I have more space for my fabric between the beginning and end of my stitch. Here I changed to a 2.5, which is your default. I changed to 2 1/4 and 2. And what I found as I sewed along on this big strip, the 3mm gave me the flattest. Good idea, I can flip it over. When I sewed on the 3mm stitch length, I got the flattest seam option on this long strip because there was plenty of room for that fabric to lay between my stitches. When I changed to the 2.5, which is usually your default, I got a little bit more waffly and weavy. When I reduced it to 2 1/4 over this long distance, it got even more so, and 2 even more ruffled. Now on a long span of fabric, there's lots of room for your fabric to stretch over the length of your area. So let's think about like the borders on your quilt. Have you ever sewn a border on a quilt and it has stretched and ruffled on the edges? This has to do with the stretch in your fabric. And maybe making a simple adjustment of using a dual feed on your machine and increasing your stitch length for those really long border pieces would help reduce that ruffle. In addition, if you are sewing long strips, think about cutting the strip parallel to the selvage. There's less stretch there. But this is just a strip. I'm not even sure. I didn't check what the selvage is. But what it told me is when I sewed together lots of these strips, maybe increasing my stitch length to 3 would be the ideal stitch idea for me, because a flat seam is going to press out nicer and crisper than one that is crinkly. Not that you can't press that crinkly out, but this is going to lay flatter in the long run. Now, having said that, I am a piecer who likes to piece really tiny pieces, and I find a 2.5mm stitch length or a 3 is far too big for stitching 1.5-inch strips or squares together, because one stitch popping out is going to affect a very large area of my piece. So I tend to reduce my stitch length to 2 1/4. But I have found that to be the best result for me on those smaller pieces. It isn't necessarily a one size fits all. Like if I put my guide here, this is going to be the best result that I have. You have to be a little bit of an investigator and feel free to play with that idea. Okay, in addition to that, let's talk about presser foot weight. With our 1/4-inch seam feet, when they sit down, especially on our bigger machines, the bottom of the foot, one side is bigger than the other. And the amount of pressure, although is equal going down onto the fabric, if you think about wearing a heel on tarmac, you are putting more pressure in that small area than you would if you had a flat-soled shoe. So if you think about that and how your fabric feeds through, if you're finding that your strip waffles off to one side as you're pulling it through and is not feeding through, the old test in sewing world would be, well, try reducing your presser foot weight by 10, see what happens. Try increasing it by 10, see what happens. Maybe decrease it by 20 or increase it by 20. Play with your presser foot weight until it feeds through with nice stitches without wavering from one side to the next. Now I find that on my machine, reducing my presser foot weight a bit creates a more even feed through my 97D foot. But this is for you to discover. Take a couple long strips of fabric, put them underneath your presser foot, and do an experiment. Mark it off. And what I found this morning, I'm going to turn this over. I had a presser weight of 40. Here was 70. And here was the default on my machine of 50. And different amounts of ruffling happened. And generally I reduced my presser foot weight, but I consulted my creative consultant on my machine, and it actually suggested increasing my presser foot weight. Now that was counterintuitive to me, but my experiment this morning suggested maybe I want to increase my presser foot weight. More investigation will have to happen because quite honestly, I've been very happy sitting at 36 on my machine. We have a question.
Yes, from Judy Hazel. You mentioned that you took the strip right out of your cabinet without pressing, but then you mentioned you didn't starch. Do you normally starch fabric that you're piecing?
If I am, Judy, that's a great question. Do I normally press fabric if I'm piecing? It depends. Do I normally starch? Prior to owning a Laura Star ironing system, I starched everything because the iron didn't relax the wrinkles well enough, and I found the starch gave my fabric nice body. But with the Laura Star ironing system, I find that that fine steam and that nice heat provides all the stability I really need in my fabric. Now, if I'm going to cut tiny little pieces and I'm going to do lots of little pieces, I do still like to add a little extra starch in that fabric prior to cutting. It just gives me crisper results. Because if you have stuck with me long enough, you know that I don't press every single seam. I press at the end. And having that little extra body allows me to use the back end of my Annie stylus to press that seam one way or the other as I go along, rather than pressing everything one way. Because when you apply heat to something, you are increasing the chances that you might stretch your fabric into its natural tendencies, and that might not be the direction you wish to go. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one other thing. Now, on the 880, it does have integrated dual feed, but because of its extra space, we also have the ability to change the rate of feed on that dual feed. That dual feed is the little foot that drops down behind, as I mentioned. And especially for pieces that are on the bias that like to stretch a little bit, and it's just a general rule of thumb or general knowledge that your feed dogs, especially on that Bernina that has full contact because of its box feed system, it's feeding your fabric all the way to the back, and it's keeping contact through the entire motion. There's more power in the feed dog than there is on the foot because the fabric just slides through the top. By adjusting the dual feed on my 880 up a bit to a rate of 2, it helps feed that top fabric through a little faster, so it's less likely to stretch as I'm sewing, and I get nice results with my triangular sewing. And that is an option available to me. That doesn't mean that without it you don't get good results. It just means for me personally, my pieces will lie flatter. I've done tests where I've done 2 triangles and I've sewn them without, and I get a little bit of a cupping, which isn't a big deal. You can press that out. But by adjusting my dual feed function up, I get a really nice flat seam again right out of the chute. And so I did this sample this morning, and here on the end I adjusted my dual feed up to 2, and here I changed it to standard, and on the edge of my fabric you can see that it's more flat here, and then it began to curl the edges of my fabric here a little bit, and that is, you know, not a big deal. I have a beautiful seam, I have a perfect seam, but me personally, I like the looks of the first one. And this is where you get to be a bit of a detective with your 1/4 inch seam choices. The last thing I want to talk about is the markings on your stitch plates that come on a BERNINA. On your BERNINA, whether you use the straight stitch plate or the wide opening, there is a mark in the middle of both of your feed dog openings. This is exactly a 1/4 inch from your needle. As you feed your fabric through, and again, you're going to take those 2.5 inch strips, you want to feed it so you can see the line. If you can't see that line, you're going to end up with a fat seam. The other part is if you were to look closely at your machine, this line tracks all the way through your feed dog. Again, if you can't see the groove in your feed dog, you're getting a fat seam. Now, if you have super fine cotton, maybe that's what you need. The thing is that this is set up to give you a nice, perfect seam every time. And when you lay your 97 foot or your 37 foot, whichever foot you have, actually be feeding this way, everything is in alignment from that little tick up through your feed dog, up alongside the side of your foot, to give you a really good visual of where your 1/4 inch seam is going. And that is very nice. Now, if you like that guide, the 97 foot comes with a guide that attaches to the arm of your machine that gives you a guide a little further in front of your foot to help you push your fabric through straight to begin with. And the last thing I want to address before we leave today, because we have run out of time, is just lost my train of thought. I remember. The last thing I want to address this morning is the beginning and ending parts of your pieces. It is a good idea to start off with a starter piece of fabric. In my case, I keep a stack of squares beside my machine, and I'll piece to the end, and I have my needle set in the down position. This is a function that you can set on your BERNINA, and even when I shut my machine off, my needle is still in the down position. When it stops in the down position, it's right at the edge of that fabric, and I slide the next square right up to the needle. That way, your feed dogs can feed the rest of this square through, and it has something to help feed the next square through. If you start just in the needle in the front, there's nothing to help. There's only the front part of your feed dog to help feed your fabric through. But by having that leader or that starter fabric, you utilize the entire length of your feed dog. You're going to get a better result because there's going to be less wobbling left and right. And the same is true when you sew off, sew into another piece of fabric. What happens when you do that is you get a natural twist in the thread at the end of your piece. And even if you cut with the scissors between those two sections, like here, you're still going to have a little bit of a twist at the beginning of the stitch of the piece and one at the end. That will help secure your threads at the end, and you'll be less likely to pop those seams open as you go. So that's a little bit about Seams Perfect. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll check on them later today as we go, but hopefully that helps clear things up. And in addition, although we didn't feature a specific machine today, we talked about technique. I want to talk about our piecing bundle, because you can purchase this without purchasing a machine. You do have the option of getting it free with a new machine, however. And can you flash up a picture for me? The piecing bundle has the block tool. It has a scissors holder. It has a thread cutter to cut those chain pieces. It has my favorite needles in there. It has the simple folded corner ruler, a stylus, a spool of Aurifil thread, magic pins, and mini wonder clips. And if you're still thinking about maybe adding to your machine collection or changing out or maybe even upgrading, we do have financing that starts to get today. It's part of the BERNINA summer sale. We have wonderful gifts with our machine purchases during this Minnesota Quilt Show time. And BERNINA has that 48-month and 60-month 0% interest rate. Plus, we have dollars off your machine purchase. If you're interested in a new machine, please stop in. We're open 10 to 5 today, 10 to 4 on Saturday, and of course you can email or call the store for more information. So thank you for joining me virtually today in the booth to talk about Seams Perfect. There's lots to cover, but hopefully I answered some of those questions that you've been mulling over, and I covered many of the ones I get asked on a regular basis. Thanks again. I'm Joy from Pine Needles Quilt and Sew in Rochester, Minnesota. Have a great afternoon.